The condition of the prisons at this season was really frightful. In Newgate, in particular, where the distemper broke out at the beginning of June, it raged with such violence that in less than a week, more than half the prisoners were swept off, and it appeared probable that, unless its fury abated, not a soul would be left alive within it. At all times, this crowded and ill-kept prison was infested by the jail fever and other pestilential disorders, but these were mild in comparison with the present terrible visitation. The atmosphere was noisome and malignant, the wards were never cleansed, and many poor wretches, who died in their cells, were left there till the attendants on the dead cart chose to drag them forth. No restraint being placed upon the sick, and the rules of the prison allowing them the free use of any strong liquors they could purchase, the scenes that occurred were too dreadful and revolting for description, and could only be paralleled by the orgies of a pandemonium. Many reckless beings, conscious that they were attacked by a fatal disorder, drank as long as they could raise the cup to their lips, and after committing the wildest and most shocking extravagances, died in a state of frenzy. Newgate became thus, as it were, the very focus of infection, where the plague assumed its worst aspect, and where its victims perished far more expeditiously than elsewhere. 2 of the turnkeys had already died of the distemper, and such was the alarm entertained, that no persons could be found to supply their places. To penetrate the recesses of the prison was almost to ensure destruction, and none but the attendants of the dead cart and the nurses attempted it. Among the latter was Judith. Employed as a nurse on the first outburst of the plague, she willingly and fearlessly undertook the office. The worse the disease became, the better pleased she appeared, and she was so utterly without apprehension, that when no one would approach the cell where some wretched sufferer lay expiring, she unhesitatingly entered it. But it was not to render aid, but to plunder, that she thus exercised her functions. She administered no medicine, dressed no tumors, and did not contribute in the slightest degree to the comfort of the miserable wretches committed to her charge. All she desired was to obtain whatever valuables they possessed, or to wring from them any secret that might afterwards be turned to account. Foreseeing that Newgate must ere long be depopulated, and having no fears for herself, she knew that she must then be liberated, and be able once more to renew her mischievous practices upon mankind. Her marvelous preservation throughout all the dangers to which she was exposed seemed almost to warrant the supposition that she had entered into a compact with the pestilence, to extend its ravages by every means in her power, on the condition of being spared herself. Soon after the outbreak of the plague in Newgate, all the debtors were liberated, and if the keepers had had their own way, the common felons would have been likewise released. But this could not be, and they were kept to perish as before described. Matters, however, grew so serious, that it became a question whether the few miserable wretches left alive ought to be longer detained, and at last the turnkeys refusing to act any longer, and delivering their keys to the governor, the whole of the prisoners were set free. On the night of their liberation, Charles and Judith proceeded to the vaults of St. Faith's, to deposit within them the plunder they had obtained in the prison. They found them entirely deserted. Neither verger, sexton, nor any other person was to be seen, and they took up their quarters in the crypt. Having brought a basket of provisions and a few bottles of wine with them, they determined to pass the night in revelry, and, accordingly, having lighted a fire with the fragments of old coffins brought from the charnel, they sat down to their meal. Having done full justice to it, and disposed of the first flask, they were about to abandon themselves to unrestrained enjoyment, when their glee was all at once interrupted by a strange and unaccountable noise in the adjoining church. Charles, who had just commenced chanting one of his wild melodies, suddenly stopped, and Judith set down the glass she had raised to her lips untested. What could it mean? Neither of them could tell. It seemed like strains of unearthly music, mixed with shrieks and groans as of tortured spirits, accompanied by peals of such laughter as might be supposed to proceed from demons. The dead are burst forth from their tombs, cried Charles, in a quavering voice, and are attended by a legion of evil spirits. It would seem so, replied Judith, rising. I should like to behold the sight. Come with me. Not for the world, rejoined Charles, shuddering, and I would recommend you to stay where you are. You may behold your dead husband among them. Do you think so? Rejoined Judith, halting. I am sure of it, cried Challis, eagerly. Stay where you are, stay where you are. As he spoke, there was another peal of infernal laughter, and the strains of music grew louder each moment. Come what may, I will see what it is, said Judith, emptying her glass, as if seeking courage from the draught. Surely, she added, in a taunting tone, you will come with me. I am afraid of nothing earthly, rejoined Challis, but I do not like to face beings of another world. Then I will go alone, rejoined Judith. Nay, that shall never be, replied Challis, tottering after her. As they opened the door and crossed the charnel, such an extraordinary combination of sounds burst upon their ears that they again paused, and looked anxiously at each other. Challis laid his hand on his companion's arm, and strove to detain her, but she would not be stayed, and he was forced to proceed. Setting down the lamp on the stone floor, Judith passed into the subterranean church, where she beheld a sight that almost petrified her. In the midst of the nave, which was illumined by a blue glimmering light, whence proceeding it was impossible to determine, stood a number of grotesque figures, apparelled in fantastic garbs, and each attended by a skeleton. Some of the latter grisly shapes were playing on tambours, others on psalteries, others on rebecks, every instrument producing the strangest sound imaginable. Viewed through the massive pillars, beneath the dark and ponderous roof, and by the mystic light before described, this strange company had a supernatural appearance, and neither Challis nor Judith doubted for a moment that they beheld before them a congregation of phantoms. An irresistible feeling of curiosity prompted them to advance. On drawing nearer, they found the assemblage comprehended all ranks of society. There was a pope in his tiara and pontifical dress, a cardinal in his cap and robes, a monarch with a scepter in his hand, and arrayed in the habiliments of royalty, a crowned queen, a bishop wearing his mitre, and carrying his crozier, an abbot, likewise in his mitre, and bearing a crozier, a duke in his robes of state, a grave canon of the church, a knight sheathed in armor, a judge, an advocate, and a magistrate, all in their robes, a mendicant friar and a nun, and the list was completed by a physician, an astrologer, a miser, a merchant, a duchess, a peddler, a soldier, a gamester, an idiot, a robber, a blind man, and a beggar, each distinguishable by his apparel. By and by, with a wild and gibbering laugh that chilled the beholder's blood, one of the tallest and grisliest of the skeletons sprang forward, and beating his drum, the whole ghostly company formed, two and two, into a line, a skeleton placing itself on the right of every mortal. In this order, the fantastic procession marched between the pillars, the unearthly music playing all the while, and disappeared at the further extremity of the church. With the last of the group, the mysterious light vanished, and Challis and his companion were left in profound darkness. What can it mean? Cried Judith, as soon as she recovered her speech. Are they human, or spirits? Human beings don't generally amuse themselves in this way, returned Challis. But hark, I still hear the music. They are above, in St. Paul's. Then I will join them, said Judith. I am resolved to see the end of it. Don't leave me behind, returned Challis, following her. I would rather keep company with Beelzebub and all his imps than be alone. Both were too well acquainted with the way to need any light. Ascending the broad stone steps, they presently emerged into the cathedral, which they found illumined by the same glimmering light as the lower church, and they perceived the ghostly assemblage gathered into an immense ring, and dancing round the tall skeleton, who continued beating his drum, and uttering a strange gibbering sound, which was echoed by the others. Each moment the dancers increased the swiftness of their pace, until at last it grew to a giddy whirl, and then, all at once, with a shriek of laughter, the whole company fell to the ground. Challis and Judith, then, for the first time, understood, from the confusion that ensued, and the exclamations uttered, that they were no spirits they had to deal with, but beings of the same mold as themselves. Accordingly, they approached the party of maskers, for such they proved, and found on inquiry that they were a party of young gallants, who, headed by the Earl of Rochester, the representative of the tall skeleton, had determined to realize the Dance of Death, as once depicted on the walls of an ancient cloister at the north of the cathedral, called Pardon Churchyard, on the walls of which, says Stowe, were artificially and richly painted the Dance of Macabre, or Dance of Death, commonly called the Dance of Pauls, the like whereof was painted about Saint Innocents, at Paris. The meters, or poesy of this dance, proceeds the same authority, were translated out of French into English by John Lydgate, Monk of Barry, and, with the picture of Death leading all estates, painted about the cloister, at the special request and expense of Jenkin Carpenter, in the reign of Henry VI. Pardon Churchyard was pulled down by the Protector Somerset, in the reign of Edward VI, and the materials employed in the erection of his own palace in the Strand. It was the discussion of these singular paintings, and of the designs on the same subject ascribed to Holbein, that led the Earl of Rochester and his companions to propose the fantastic spectacle above described. With the disposition which this reckless nobleman possessed to turn the most solemn and appalling subjects to jest, he thought no season so fitting for such an entertainment as the present, just as in our own time the lively Parisians made the cholera, while raging in their city, the subject of a carnival pastime. The exhibition witnessed by Challis and Judith was a rehearsal of the masque intended to be represented in the cathedral on the following night. Again marshalling his band, the Earl of Rochester beat his drum, and skipping before them, led the way towards the south door of the cathedral, which was thrown open by an unseen hand, and the procession glided through it like a troop of spectres. Challis, whose appearance was not unlike that of an animated skeleton, was seized with a strange desire to join in what was going forward, and taking off his doublet, and baring his bony arms and legs, he followed the others, dancing round Judith in the same manner that the other skeletons danced round their partners. On reaching the Convocation House, a door was opened, and the procession entered the cloisters, and here Challis, dragging Judith into the area between him and the beautiful structure they surrounded, began a dance of so extraordinary a character that the whole troop collected round to witness it. Rochester beat his drum, and the other representatives of mortality who were provided with musical instruments struck up a wild kind of accompaniment, to which Challis executed the most grotesque flourishes. So wildly excited did he become, and such extravagances did he commit, that even Judith stared aghast at him, and began to think his wits were fled. Now he whirled round her, now sprang high into the air, now twined his lean arms round her waist, now peeped over one shoulder, now over the other, and at last griped her neck so forcibly, that he might perhaps have strangled her, if she had not broken from him, and dealt him a severe blow that brought him senseless to the ground. On recovering, he found himself in the arched entrance of a large octagonal chamber, lighted at each side by a lofty pointed window filled with stained glass. Round this chamber ran a wide stone bench, with a richly carved back of the same material, on which the maskers were seated, and opposite the entrance was a raised seat, ordinarily allotted to the Dean, but now occupied by the Earl of Rochester. A circular oak table stood in the midst of the chamber, covered with magnificent silver dishes, heaped with the choicest viands, which were handed to the guests by the Earl's servants, all of whom represented skeletons, and it had a strange effect, to behold these ghastly objects filling the cups of the revellers, bending obsequiously before some blooming dame, or crowding round their spectral-looking lord. At first, Challis was so confused, that he thought he must have awakened in another world, but by degrees he called to mind what had occurred, and ascertained from Judith that he was in the Convocation House. Getting up, he joined the train of grisly attendants, and acquitted himself so well that the Earl engaged him as performer in the masque. He was furthermore informed that, in all probability, the king himself, with many of his favorite nobles, and the chief court beauties, would be present to witness the spectacle. The banquet over, word was brought that chairs and coaches were without, and the company departed, leaving behind only a few attendants, who remained to put matters in order. While they were thus occupied, Judith, who had fixed her greedy eyes upon the plate, observed, in an undertone, to Challis, "There will be fine plunder for us. We must manage to carry off all that plate while they are engaged in the masque." "You must do it yourself, then," returned Challis, in the same tone, "for I shall have to play a principal part in the entertainment, and as the king himself will be present, I cannot give up such an opportunity of distinguishing myself." "You can have no share in the prize if you lend no assistance," replied Judith, with a dissatisfied look. "Of course not," rejoined Chowles, "on this occasion it is all yours. The dance of death is too much to my taste to be given up." Perceiving they were noticed, Chowles and Judith then left the convocation house, and returned to the vault in St. Faith's, nor did they emerge from it until late on the following day. Some rumor of the mask having gone abroad, towards evening a crowd, chiefly composed of the most worthless order of society, collected under the portico at the western entrance, and the great doors being opened by Chowles, they entered the cathedral. Thus was this sacred building once more invaded, once again a scene of noise, riot, and confusion. Its vaulted roofs, instead of echoing the voice of prayer, or the choral hymn, resounded with loud laughter, imprecations, and licentious discourse. This disorder, however, was kept in some bounds by a strong body of the royal guard, who soon afterwards arrived, and stationing themselves in parties of 3 or 4 at each of the massive columns flanking the aisles, maintained some show of decorum. Besides these, there were others of the royal attendants, bearing torches, who walked from place to place, and compelled all loiterers in dark corners to proceed to the nave. A little before midnight, the great doors were again thrown open, and a large troop of richly attired personages, all wearing masks, were admitted. For a short time they paced to and fro between its shafted pillars, gazing at the spectators grouped around, and evidently, from their jests and laughter, not a little entertained by the scene. As the clock struck 12, however, all sounds were hushed, and the courtly party stationed themselves on the steps leading to the choir. At the same moment, also, the torches were extinguished, and the whole of the building buried in profound darkness. Presently after, a sound was heard of footsteps approaching the nave, but nothing could be discerned. Expectation was kept on the rack for some minutes, during which many a stifled cry was heard from those whose courage failed them at this trying juncture. All at once, a blue light illumined the nave, and partially revealed the lofty pillars by which it was surrounded. By this light the whole of the ghostly company could be seen drawn up near the western door. They were arranged 2 and 2, a skeleton standing as before on the right of each character. The procession next marched slowly and silently towards the choir, and drew up at the foot of the steps, to give the royal party an opportunity of examining them. After pausing there for a few minutes, Rochester, in the dress of the larger skeleton, started off, and, beating his drum, was followed by the Pope and his attendant skeleton. This couple, having danced together for some minutes, to the infinite diversion of the spectators, disappeared behind a pillar, and were succeeded by the monarch and his second skeleton. These, in their turn, gave way to the cardinal and his companion, and so on till the whole of the maskers had exhibited themselves, when at a signal from the earl the party reappeared, and formed a ring round him. The dance was executed with great spirit, and elicited tumultuous applause from all the beholders. The earl now retired, and Chowles took his place. He was clothed in an elastic dress painted of a leaden and cadaverous color, which fitted closely to his fleshless figure, and defined all his angularities. He carried an hourglass in one hand and a dart in the other, and in the course of the dance kept continually pointing the latter at those who moved around him. His feats of the previous evening were nothing to his present achievements. His joints creaked, and his eyes flamed like burning coals. As he continued, his excitement increased. He bounded higher, and his countenance assumed so hideous an expression, that those near him recoiled in terror, crying, Death himself had broke loose among them. The consternation soon became general. The maskers fled in dismay, and scampered along the aisles scarcely knowing whither they were going. Delighted with the alarm he occasioned, Chowles chased a large party along the northern aisle, and was pursuing them across the transept upon which it opened, when he was arrested in his turn by another equally formidable figure, who suddenly placed himself in his path. "Hold," exclaimed Solomon Eagle, for it was the enthusiast, in a voice of thunder, "it is time this scandalous exhibition should cease. Know all ye who make a mockery of death, that his power will be speedily and fearfully approved upon you. Thine not to escape the vengeance of the great being whose temple you have profaned. And you, O king, who have sanctioned these evil doings by your presence, and who by your own dissolute life set a pernicious example to all your subjects, know that your city shall be utterly laid waste, first by plague and then by fire. Tremble! My warning is as terrible and true as the handwriting on the wall. Who art thou who holdest this language towards me? Demanded Charles. I am called Solomon Eagle, replied the enthusiast, and am charged with a mission from on high to warn your doomed people of their fate. Be warned yourself, sire. Your end will be sudden. You will be snatched away in the midst of your guilty pleasure, and with little time for repentance. Be warned, I say again. With this he turned to depart. Secure the knave, cried Charles, angrily. He shall be soundly scourged for his insolence. But bursting through the guard, Solomon Eagle ran swiftly up the choir and disappeared, nor could his pursuers discover any traces of him. Strange, exclaimed the king, when he was told of the enthusiast's escape. Let us go to supper. This mask has given me the vapors. Pray heaven it have not given us the plague, observed the fair Stuart, who stood beside him, taking his arm. It is to be hoped not, rejoined Charles, but, odds fish, it is a most dismal affair. It is so, in more ways than one, replied Rochester, for I have just learnt that all my best plate has been carried off from the convocation house. I shall only be able to offer your majesty and your fair partner a sorry supper.